Number 1. Toby Stangl. On June 3, 2011, Toby Stangl carried out one of the most frightening acts of random violence in Hawaii's modern history. In the middle of afternoon rush hour, he transformed Honolulu's H1 freeway into an active shooting scene, trapping hundreds of motorists with no escape. Stangl was born and raised in Hawaii. He lived a largely unremarkable life and worked various jobs over the years. To most people around him, he appeared quiet and withdrawn, someone who kept to himself. He had no significant criminal history, no known violent offenses, and no documented pattern of aggression that would have predicted what was coming. In the weeks leading up to the shooting, however, people close to Stangl later reported a noticeable change in his behavior. He became increasingly paranoid. He spoke about being followed. He believed unnamed individuals were watching him and plotting to harm him. These fears were not grounded in reality, but they consumed him. Despite these warning signs, no intervention occurred. On the afternoon of June 3rd, Stangl loaded firearms into his vehicle and drove toward the H1 freeway, one of the busiest roadways in Hawaii. At the time, thousands of drivers were heading home, boxed in by traffic with limited exits and nowhere to run. Once on the freeway, Stangl began firing at vehicles without warning. He drove alongside cars and opened fire, then accelerated ahead, weaving between lanes and continuing to shoot. There was no argument, no confrontation, and no personal grievance. The violence was completely indiscriminate. One of the first victims was Tammy Inouye, a mother of 10 who was driving her minivan with her daughter seated beside her. Stangl pulled alongside the vehicle and fired. Inouye was struck by gunfire, lost control of the minivan, and crashed. She died at the scene. Her daughter survived and witnessed the killing. Stangl did not stop. He continued down the freeway, firing into additional vehicles. 2 other drivers were wounded as bullets shattered windows, pierced doors, and ricocheted inside moving cars. Panic spread instantly. Drivers slammed on brakes, abandoned vehicles in live traffic lanes, and ran for cover wherever they could find it. Others stayed frozen inside their cars, unsure where the shots were coming from or when the next round would hit. Emergency dispatch centers were overwhelmed with calls. Dozens of motorists reported an active shooter on the freeway, describing gunfire erupting around them as traffic ground to a halt. Honolulu police responded within minutes. Patrol units entered the freeway from multiple directions, attempting to locate and stop the shooter while avoiding further civilian casualties. When officers closed in on Stangl's vehicle, he fired at police as well, striking patrol cars during the pursuit. The chase extended across several miles of freeway. Officers coordinated to contain the threat, block traffic, and prevent Stangl from reaching denser areas. Eventually, police boxed in his vehicle and forced it to stop. Stangl was taken into custody without further shots fired. By then, the damage was irreversible.
Investigators immediately began reconstructing the attack. They found no connection between Stangl and any of the victims. Tammy Inouye had never met him. The wounded drivers were complete strangers. Ballistic analysis confirmed that the firearms recovered from Stangl matched the bullets and shell casings found along the freeway. Eyewitness accounts from dozens of drivers established a clear timeline. Video evidence, forensic findings, and police reports all pointed to a deliberate, sustained attack carried out in full awareness of the danger it posed. Stangl made statements to police that reflected paranoid thinking, claiming he believed he was under threat. Investigators acknowledged his mental instability, but noted that his actions showed planning and intent. He selected a crowded public roadway, loaded multiple firearms, aimed at occupied vehicles, and fired repeatedly over an extended period. In 2013, Stangl stood trial. His defense argued diminished capacity, claiming that his paranoia prevented him from understanding right from wrong at the time of the shooting. They portrayed him as a man overwhelmed by delusions, acting out of irrational fear rather than malice. prosecutors countered with evidence of conscious decision-making. They emphasized that Stengel prepared in advance, chose a time and place guaranteed to maximize danger, adjusted his driving to line up shots, and continued firing even as police pursued him. The jury rejected the defense. Stengel was convicted on multiple counts, including murder, attempted murder, and assault against law enforcement officers. At sentencing, the judge described the attack as one of the most reckless and dangerous crimes ever committed on Hawaii's roadways. Stengel was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms with a mandatory minimum of 60 years before parole eligibility. At sentencing, Tammy Enuan's family spoke about the loss of a mother who had devoted her life to raising her children. Her 10 children were left without her because of a crime that had no reason and no warning. The surviving victims described long-term physical injuries and lasting psychological trauma, including fear of driving and recurring nightmares. The case sparked statewide discussion about mental health intervention, public safety, and the limits of crisis response. Officials acknowledged that signs of Stengel's mental deterioration had been visible, but no system existed to intervene before his paranoia turned lethal. Toby Stengel remains incarcerated in Hawaii, serving life sentences with no realistic chance of release. The H1 freeway returned to normal traffic flow, but for those who were trapped there that afternoon, the memory of gunfire echoing through rush-hour lanes never faded. And while this crime unfolded in full public view, other cases in Hawaii would prove even more disturbing. Crimes committed quietly by people far closer to their victims, hidden behind closed doors until it was too late. Number 2. Juan Barron. In 2022, something about a quiet residence in Hawaii's Lower Ridge area began to feel wrong. Neighbors noticed irregular activity. A house that should have been occupied by a single elderly man now had a younger stranger coming and going, driving the homeowner's car, handling his affairs. What they didn't know was that they were already months too late. Inside that home lay one of the most disturbing crimes in recent Hawaiian history. Juan Barron arrived in Hawaii in his early 20s, like many young men drawn to the islands in search of work and opportunity. At 23 years old, he blended easily into the background. He worked odd jobs, kept to himself, and had no significant criminal record. Nothing about him suggested violence or cruelty. To outsiders, he was simply another transient presence in a city full of them. Barron eventually crossed paths with Gary Ruby, a 73-year-old retired man who lived alone in an upscale Lower Ridge neighborhood. Ruby was financially comfortable, socially isolated, and known to be kind. Investigators later confirmed that Ruby had allowed Barron into his home, though the exact circumstances remain unclear. It may have started as temporary housing, informal work, or companionship. What is clear is that Ruby trusted him. That trust would cost Ruby his life. At some point inside that home, Barron decided he wanted everything Ruby had: the house, the car, the money, and the freedom to live without consequences. Investigators believe the killing was not spontaneous, but calculated. Barron strangled Ruby using a belt, overpowering the elderly man with ease. But the killing itself was only the beginning. Instead of calling for help, fleeing, or even attempting to hide the body in a conventional way, Barron chose something far more deliberate and disturbing. He placed Ruby's body in the bathtub and began pouring concrete over him. According to court records and expert testimony, there is evidence suggesting Ruby may have still been alive during this process, immobilized, suffocating, and trapped as the concrete hardened around him. When the concrete set, Ruby was sealed inside his own bathroom. With Ruby gone, Barron stepped directly into his life. He began driving Ruby's vehicle openly. He used Ruby's credit cards and bank accounts. He lived inside the house as if it belonged to him. To anyone outside, it appeared that Ruby had simply taken in a younger companion or caregiver. Neighbors saw nothing overtly alarming. No one heard screams. No obvious signs of a struggle were visible from the outside. For months, Barron lived freely in the stolen life of a dead man, eating, sleeping, spending money, while Ruby's remains decomposed just feet away, encased in concrete. The deception only began to unravel when Ruby's family and friends grew concerned. Calls went unanswered, messages were ignored, attempts to visit were blocked or delayed. Barron provided excuses, claiming Ruby was unavailable, sick, or didn't want visitors. Eventually, the concern escalated to authorities. When police conducted a welfare check, the house immediately raised red flags. Ruby was nowhere to be found, yet his belongings were being used. The bathtub stood out, unusually heavy, sealed, and visibly altered. Investigators broke through the hardened concrete. What they found confirmed the worst fears. Ruby's body was recovered from the bathtub, entombed in solid concrete. Forensic examination confirmed his identity and established death by strangulation. Financial records showed extensive use of Ruby's accounts after his disappearance. Surveillance footage captured Barron driving Ruby's car. Digital records, receipts, and timestamps all pointed to a single conclusion. Barron hadn't just killed Ruby, he had replaced him. Confronted with overwhelming evidence, Barron eventually confessed. His statements aligned with forensic findings and revealed details only the killer could know. In 2024, he formally admitted responsibility for the murder. In July 2025, Barron was sentenced to life in prison with a mandatory minimum of 20 years before parole eligibility. During sentencing, the judge described the crime as exceptionally cruel, highlighting the exploitation of an elderly man's trust and the deliberate effort to erase his existence. The courtroom heard how Ruby's final moments were spent alone, restrained, and betrayed by someone he had allowed into his home. His family described Ruby as generous and trusting, someone who believed in helping others, even strangers. That generosity made him vulnerable, and Barron exploited it completely. After sentencing, the case took another disturbing turn. Barron attempted to withdraw his guilty plea, claiming he wanted to fight the charges. Legal experts quickly dismissed the move as a last-ditch effort. Prosecutors emphasized that Barron had confessed in detail, had competent legal representation, and knowingly accepted the plea. The physical evidence alone made any reversal extremely unlikely. As of now, the courts have not granted relief. For the Lower Ridge community, the revelation was deeply unsettling. Residents struggled to accept that someone they had casually observed, someone living among them, had been occupying a stolen life while the homeowner lay hidden inside the same house. The crime shattered the illusion of safety that often surrounds quiet, affluent neighborhoods. The case exposed how isolation can become lethal. Ruby lived alone. He didn't have daily visitors. No one noticed immediately when he disappeared. That gap gave Barron the time he needed to carry out the crime and maintain the lie. Advocates for elderly safety cited the case as a warning about unchecked trust, social isolation, and how easily predators can exploit vulnerable individuals who live alone. Today, Juan Barron remains behind bars, his future defined by decades of incarceration. His name is permanently tied to one of Hawaii's most disturbing crimes, not just for the murder itself, but for the cold precision that followed. A concrete bathtub, a stolen identity, a man erased inside his own home. And while this case exposed the dangers of trust misplaced inside a quiet neighborhood, the next story would reveal a different kind of horror, one rooted not in deception, but in betrayal by those expected to uphold the law itself.
Number 3. Kirk Matthew Langford. On April 12, 2007, 21-year-old Masumi Watanabe,
a Japanese tourist visiting Oahu, vanished while walking along Pupukea Road on Hawaii's North Shore. What initially appeared to be a missing person case would become one of the most disturbing no-body murder convictions in Hawaii's history. Masumi Watanabe had traveled from Japan to experience life in Hawaii. She was staying with family friends near Pupukea and volunteered at a local elementary school. Described as shy and artistic, she spoke very little English and suffered from severely impaired vision, requiring prescription glasses. Almost every day, she walked the same 2.5-mile stretch between her residence and the Foodland grocery store along Pupukea Road, a quiet route locals considered safe. That sense of safety shattered the morning she disappeared. Witnesses last saw Watanabe between 9:20 and 10 a.m. walking downhill along Pupukea Road. Several people reported seeing her enter a Hau'oli termite and pest control truck near the Foodland parking lot. She appeared confused. The driver was speaking to her. She was not responding. She was never seen alive again. Within days, police began focusing on Kirk Matthew Langford, a 22-year-old pest control technician who lived in Kalihi. Langford had been working in the Pupukea area that morning. When investigators searched his company truck, they found Masumi Watanabe's blood, her eyeglasses, and personal belongings inside the vehicle. The passenger side windshield was cracked. Langford claimed the damage was caused by a bird. The evidence told a different story. Despite extensive searches across Oahu, including ocean searches, land searches, and volunteer efforts, Masumi Watanabe's body was never found. But Hawaii law does not require a body to prosecute a murder, and prosecutors believed they had more than enough proof. Langford was arrested 14 days after her disappearance and charged with second-degree murder. At trial, Langford denied killing Watanabe, but admitted she was dead. His explanation shifted repeatedly. Initially, he told police he had never seen her. Later, under oath, he claimed he had accidentally struck her with his truck, causing only minor injuries. He said he offered her a ride because she could not communicate clearly in English. According to Langford, while he was driving her, Watanabe suddenly jumped from the moving truck, struck her head on a rock, and died instantly. Prosecutors dismantled that story piece by piece. Crash reconstruction experts testified that if Watanabe had been struck by a vehicle as Langford claimed, she would have suffered catastrophic injuries, not minor scratches. The truck's side mirror and antenna were intact, damage that should have been present if contact had occurred. No blood was found in the truck bed where Langford said he placed her body. No blood was found on rocks where he claimed she hit her head. A witness later testified seeing a man digging a hole near Kahana Bay around midnight on April 12th. The man claimed he was searching for a lost gold chain. The witness wrote down the license plate number. It matched Langford's personal truck. The witness later identified Langford in a police lineup. Langford admitted he attempted to bury Watanabe's body, then claimed he dumped it into the ocean after being seen. Investigators did not believe him. Experts testified that if the body had been placed in the ocean, it likely would have washed ashore. Instead, authorities believe her remains are buried somewhere on Oahu, undiscovered to this day. Throughout the investigation, the surrounding community changed. Residents along Pupukea Road stopped walking alone. Parents no longer allowed children outside unsupervised. A road once filled with joggers and pedestrians fell silent. Locals spoke openly about fear, not of strangers, but of how easily danger had blended into daily life. Langford's own neighbors were stunned. He was described as quiet, polite, deeply religious, a husband and father who hosted Bible studies at his home. Church members defended him publicly. His parents insisted police were lying. His employer terminated him immediately after his arrest. The jury was not persuaded by his claims of innocence. In April 2008, Nearly 1 year after Watanabe vanished, Kirk Matthew Lankford was found guilty of second-degree murder. At sentencing, Judge Carl Sakamoto called him a predator and a danger to the community. Lankford was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. In 2009, the parole board set his minimum term at 150 years, requiring him to serve at least 50 years before parole eligibility. Masumi Watanabe's parents attended every hearing. They begged Lankford to reveal where their daughter's body was so she could be returned to Japan. He refused. Her remains have never been recovered. To this day, Pupukea Road carries the weight of what happened there. A place once considered harmless became a reminder of how quickly trust can turn fatal, and how a single encounter can erase a life without leaving a body behind. Kirk Matthew Lankford remains incarcerated. Masumi Watanabe remains missing. And while this case revealed how a stranger could vanish in plain sight, the next case would prove that sometimes the most dangerous threats are the ones hiding behind authority, uniforms, and trust.
Number 4. Eric Thompson. Jealousy has ended countless relationships, but in rare cases, it becomes something far more dangerous, a force powerful enough to override reason, morality, and restraint. In Hawaii, the case of Eric Thompson became a stark example of how emotional obsession can escalate into irreversible violence. From the outside, Eric Thompson's life appeared stable. He was married to his wife Joyce Thompson, financially secure and living a relatively quiet life in Hawaii. There were no public signs of instability, no criminal record, no reputation for violence. But behind closed doors, his marriage was unraveling. Joyce Thompson had begun an affair with John Tokuhara, a respected local acupuncturist. Tokuhara was known in the community as calm, soft-spoken, and dedicated to helping others through healing practices. He lived a low-profile life and had no known history of conflict or violence. When Eric discovered the affair, something inside him shifted. Instead of pursuing separation, divorce, or counseling, Eric became consumed by anger. Friends and acquaintances would later describe a man fixated on betrayal, unable to let go of the humiliation he felt. His emotional state deteriorated, fueled by jealousy and resentment toward the man he believed had destroyed his marriage. In 2022, that resentment turned deadly. Eric Thompson sought out John Tokuhara. The confrontation was not spontaneous. At some point before it occurred, Eric armed himself. When he encountered Tokuhara, he did not argue, threaten, or attempt reconciliation. He opened fire. Tokuhara was shot multiple times in the face at close range, an unmistakably personal and violent act. The wounds were catastrophic. There was no opportunity for medical intervention. John Tokuhara died at the scene. Eric Thompson was quickly identified as the shooter. Investigators found no evidence of self-defense. The motive appeared clear: jealousy driven by an extramarital affair. To prosecutors, the case seemed straightforward, but the courtroom would tell a different story. The first trial ended in a hung jury. Jurors were divided. Some believed Eric Thompson acted during an emotional breakdown, a crime of passion rather than a calculated killing. Others believed the evidence clearly showed intent and planning. Because the jury could not reach a unanimous verdict, no conviction was secured. For Tokuhara's family, the outcome was devastating. They had sat through graphic testimony, forensic details, and painful descriptions of how their loved one died, only to walk away without justice. The possibility that Eric Thompson might never be convicted loomed heavily over them. Prosecutors chose to retry the case. The second trial, held in February 2025, was markedly different. This time, the prosecution focused heavily on intent. Medical examiners testified that the placement and number of gunshot wounds showed deliberate targeting.
Ballistics experts explained that the shots were fired at close range, ruling out panic or accidental discharge. Investigators presented evidence of Eric's behavior in the weeks leading up to the killing, messages, witness statements, and actions that suggested growing obsession and rage.
The defense once again argued diminished capacity. Eric's attorneys claimed that discovering the affair triggered extreme emotional distress that impaired his ability to make rational decisions. Mental health experts testified about how betrayal can affect cognition, judgment, and impulse control. They portrayed Eric not as a calculated killer, but as a man overwhelmed by emotional trauma. But the prosecution dismantled that argument. They reminded jurors that Eric had brought a loaded firearm to the confrontation, that he sought Tokuhara out rather than avoiding him, that firing multiple shots into a person's face required sustained intent, not momentary loss of control. Emotional pain, they argued, does not excuse execution-style violence. This time, the jury agreed. Eric Thompson was found guilty of killing John Tokuhara. In June 2025, he was sentenced to life in prison with a mandatory minimum of 15 years before parole eligibility, plus an additional 20 years for use of a firearm. The combined sentence ensured decades of incarceration. At sentencing, the judge acknowledged that emotional distress can explain why someone acts, but it can never justify taking a life. Throughout the proceedings, Joyce Thompson remained by Eric's side. She attended hearings, sat through testimony, and expressed continued support for her husband. Her presence sparked debate. Some saw her as a victim trapped in the aftermath of a tragedy she never intended to cause. Others viewed her loyalty as puzzling, even disturbing given the consequences of the affair. Speculation ranged from guilt to unconditional devotion. Eric Thompson continues to maintain that the shooting was misrepresented and has filed an appeal. Legal experts, however, believe the chances of overturning the conviction are slim given the evidence and the second jury's clear verdict. The appeals process may stretch on for years, prolonging the pain for Tokuhara's family. For those who knew John Tokuhara, no sentence can restore what was lost. He was a healer by profession, someone whose life revolved around easing pain rather than causing it. His death removed a valued member of the community and left behind clients, friends, and family struggling to understand how jealousy could escalate into murder. The case reignited conversations about romantic jealousy, possessiveness, and the dangerous myth that crimes of passion are somehow more understandable or excusable. Advocates emphasized that inability to accept the end of a relationship is one of the most consistent warning signs preceding violent acts. Eric Thompson's case stands as a grim reminder. Unchecked emotions, when combined with entitlement and obsession, can destroy multiple lives in a single moment. His jealousy cost John Tokuhara his life, shattered families on both sides, and ensured that Eric himself will spend most of his remaining years behind bars. And yet, as tragic as this case was, Hawaii had already endured a mystery even darker, one that lingered for nearly 2 decades. A case involving a missing child, a respected family, and secrets buried far deeper than anyone imagined.
Number 5. The Xerox Murders. Byron Koji Uesugi. Some crimes don't just devastate families, they permanently shatter a place's sense of safety. On the morning of November 2, 1999, Hawaii experienced a level of violence it had never seen before. What unfolded inside a Xerox facility in Honolulu would become the deadliest mass murder in the state's history, forcing Hawaii to confront the reality of workplace violence. The man responsible was Byron Koji Uesugi, a longtime Xerox service technician. Quiet, withdrawn, and increasingly consumed by paranoia, resentment, and rage. Uesugi was born in 1959 and raised in the Nuuanu neighborhood of Honolulu. As a teenager, he attended Roosevelt High School, where classmates remembered him as quiet and disciplined. He was part of the Army JROTC program and a member of the school's riflery team, an early indication of his comfort with firearms. According to his family, something changed after high school. In 1977, shortly after graduation, Uesugi was involved in a car accident in which he hit his head on the windshield. His brother later said Byron was never the same afterward. By 1984, Uesugi was working for Xerox, servicing copy machines across Oahu. Outside of work, he had two consuming hobbies: breeding koi and goldfish and collecting firearms. By the late 1990s, he legally owned as many as 25 guns, including handguns, rifles, and shotguns. For years, he functioned quietly until cracks began to form. After being transferred to a new work group, Uesugi became convinced that his coworkers were harassing him, sabotaging his work, and conspiring against him. He made repeated complaints that investigators later determined were unfounded. Former coworkers said he became increasingly isolated, withdrawn, and angry. In 1993, his behavior escalated. After damaging an elevator door during a workplace outburst, Uesugi was arrested for criminal property damage and ordered to undergo psychiatric evaluation and anger management. Doctors diagnosed him with paranoid and delusional thinking, but determined he was not dangerous at the time. Behind the scenes, the paranoia only worsened. Uesugi claimed to hear voices. He said a dark shadow followed him. He believed his home was bugged with listening devices, and coworkers were tampering with his prized fish. At one point, a Shingon priest was brought in to bless the family home. Even the priest suspected mental illness. Coworkers later testified that Uesugi openly talked about killing people at work as early as 1995 if he were ever fired. One coworker recalled him saying, "I'll shoot all of them." Despite these warning signs, Uesugi remained employed. By late 1999, Xerox began phasing out the copy model Uesugi specialized in. He resisted training on the new machines, convinced he wouldn't be able to keep up. On November 1, 1999, his manager informed him that training would begin the following day. In Uesugi's mind, that conversation sealed his fate. Later, he would tell a forensic psychiatrist, "I decided to give them a reason to fire me." The morning of November 2, 1999. Just after 8 a.m., Byron Uesugi arrived at the Xerox facility on North Nimitz Highway. He was armed with a 9mm Glock handgun. He walked calmly into the building and headed to the second floor, where coworkers were gathering for a routine meeting. What followed was execution-style violence. Uesugi opened fire, shooting his supervisor and 6 coworkers. Some were killed in a conference room. Others were shot nearby. One employee managed to flee down a stairwell as Uesugi fired at him, narrowly missing. In total, 7 men were killed. Christopher Balatico, 33, Ford Kanehira, 41, Ronald Kataoka, 50, Ronald Kawamai, 54, Melvin Lee, 58, Peter Mark, 46, John Sakamoto, 36. All were coworkers, all were unarmed, all were dead within minutes. Uesugi then left the building in a company van, triggering a massive police response. Streets were shut down, nearby homes were evacuated, school children on a nearby field trip were rushed to safety. Police eventually cornered Uesugi in the hills above downtown Honolulu. For nearly 5 hours, negotiators pleaded with him. He paced beside the van, gun still in hand. Shortly before 3 p.m., Uesugi surrendered without resistance. Uesugi pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. His defense presented psychiatric experts who testified that he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and delusional disorder. They argued he genuinely believed his coworkers were plotting against him. The prosecution did not deny his mental illness, but argued that Uesugi knew exactly what he was doing. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Michael Wellner testified that Uesugi planned the attack, brought a loaded weapon, selectively targeted coworkers, fled the scene, and attempted to avoid capture, all signs he understood right from wrong. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury rejected the insanity defense. Uesugi was found guilty of 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. On August 8, 2000, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Hawaii does not have the death penalty. The Xerox murders changed Hawaii forever. It exposed how warning signs of workplace violence can be ignored, minimized, or mishandled. Families of the victims later sued Xerox and the hospital that evaluated Uesugi, arguing that clear indicators of danger had been overlooked. Xerox eventually vacated the building where the massacre occurred. Years later, it would be reused as a film set, a grim reminder of how ordinary places can become scenes of unimaginable horror. Today, Byron Koji Uesugi remains incarcerated at Tallahatchie County Correctional Facility in Mississippi, transferred there due to overcrowding in Hawaii's prison system. He has never expressed genuine remorse. The Xerox murders remain the worst mass killing in Hawaii's history, a tragedy born not from sudden chaos, but from years of ignored warnings, untreated illness, and unchecked resentment. 7 lives were lost that morning, and an entire state was forced to confront the truth. Even paradise is not immune to violence. Number 6. Christopher Deedy. Some cases divide a community, not because the facts are missing, but because the truth itself forces people to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, privilege, and accountability. The killing of Colin Elderts inside a Waikiki McDonald's by federal agent Christopher Deedy became one of the most polarizing incidents in modern Hawaiian history, not just for what happened that night, but for what followed afterward. Christopher Deedy arrived in Honolulu in November 2011 as part of a U.S. State Department security detail assigned to the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, an international event that brought world leaders to the islands. As a diplomatic security agent, Deedy carried authority, training, and a government-issued firearm. But on his very first night in Hawaii, instead of preparing for his official duties, he went bar-hopping through Waikiki, drinking heavily as the night wore on. In the early morning hours of November 5th, Deedy entered a McDonald's on Kalakaua Avenue, intoxicated and looking for food. Inside the restaurant was Colin Elderts, a 23-year-old local man of native Hawaiian descent who had also been drinking that night. What began as a verbal exchange quickly escalated into a confrontation. Accounts of what happened next would later conflict, but what is undisputed is how it ended. Deedy drew his firearm and fired multiple shots. Colin Elderts was struck and collapsed inside the restaurant. He died at the scene. A young local man was dead on the floor of a fast food restaurant, and the man who killed him was a federal agent, armed, intoxicated, and off-duty. Deedy immediately claimed self-defense. He told investigators that Elderts had been aggressive, that he feared for his life, and that he had no choice but to shoot. But witnesses offered differing versions of events. Some said Elderts was confrontational. Others said Deedy escalated the situation, inserting himself into a dispute and using lethal force where it was not necessary. Surveillance footage captured parts of the incident but failed to clearly resolve the most critical moments, leaving room for interpretation and doubt. What was clear, however, was that Deedy had been drinking heavily, that he was carrying a loaded firearm while intoxicated, and that his decisions directly led to a fatal outcome. For many in Hawaii, those facts alone made the shooting impossible to justify. When the case went to trial in 2013, it quickly became more than a criminal proceeding. It became a flashpoint for long-standing tensions between local communities and federal authority. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, chanting Colin Elderts' name and demanding accountability. To them, Deedy represented mainland privilege, a government agent who came to Hawaii, disrespected the community, and took a local life without consequence. Didi's supporters argued the opposite. They claimed he was doing his job, that he had the legal right to defend himself, and that the shooting was a tragic but justified act of self-preservation. Inside the courtroom, jurors struggled with the same questions that were tearing the public apart. The first trial ended in a hung jury. Jurors could not unanimously agree on whether Didi's actions met the legal standard for self-defense or whether he had committed manslaughter. For Eldert's family, it was devastating. They had sat through days of testimony, graphic evidence, and emotional arguments, only to walk away without a verdict. The case was retried in 2014, and once again, the jury was divided. Didi was acquitted of second-degree murder, but jurors deadlocked on the lesser charge of manslaughter. The result satisfied no one. Some believed Didi had escaped justice. Others believed the system had worked as intended. What remained was a deep sense of unresolved grief. After years of legal proceedings, prosecutors ultimately chose not to pursue a third trial. The decision effectively ended the case. Christopher Didi faced no criminal conviction for Colin Eldert's death. He returned to the mainland and resumed his life. For Eldert's family, the legal system had closed its doors without delivering accountability. The impact of the case rippled far beyond the courtroom. In Hawaii, particularly among native Hawaiian communities, it became a symbol of unequal justice. Many felt the law had protected Didi because of his federal status, while a local family was left with nothing but loss. The case raised serious questions about off-duty conduct for armed federal agents, the dangers of mixing alcohol and firearms, and whether self-defense claims should apply when the shooter helped create the danger in the first place. Critics argued that Didi's decisions that night mattered, that choosing to drink heavily, carry a weapon, and engage in confrontations should not be erased by a self-defense claim. Supporters countered that fear is fear, regardless of circumstance. The law, as applied in this case, sided with uncertainty. The McDonald's where the shooting occurred eventually returned to being just another late-night stop in Waikiki. But for many in Hawaii, the memory of that night never faded. Colin Eldert's name became a rallying cry, remembered in vigils, protests, and community gatherings. His mother spoke publicly about her son, describing a young man proud of his heritage, loved by his family, and deserving of a future that was taken from him in seconds. Christopher Didi remains free in the eyes of the law, but in the court of public opinion, especially in Hawaii, the verdict was far less forgiving. The case exposed fault lines in how justice is perceived and applied, and it left behind a lingering question that still echoes across the islands. When authority, alcohol, and lethal force collide, who is truly held accountable? And while this case ended without a conviction, another tragedy would soon show that even without a body, persistence and evidence can still bring devastating truths into the light. Number 9. Mike Meesk. Mike Meesk appeared to be a successful businessman in Honolulu. He owned a pest control company, had a reputation in the local business community, and maintained connections across the islands. On the surface, he was legitimate, charitable, and respected. Beneath that facade, federal investigators say Meesk ran a sprawling criminal empire for nearly 20 years. His network controlled narcotics trafficking, extortion, intimidation, violence, and even chemical weapons. Meesk's operations were organized, sophisticated, and operated under the guise of a legitimate business. Meesk used his pest control company to launder money, move freely across Oahu, and carry out criminal activity without raising suspicion. Employees, associates, and enforcers executed his orders, creating a climate of fear. Anyone who disobeyed, threatened the organization, or cooperated with authorities faced retaliation. Meesk's influence extended into nightclubs, private businesses, residential areas, and even political circles. The case that ultimately exposed Meesk began with the death of Jonathan Fraser in 2016. Fraser was a young man whose death prosecutors allege was linked to Meesk's personal vendetta. Meesk blamed Fraser for events surrounding the death of his own son years earlier. Consumed by grief and rage, he allegedly ordered Fraser's abduction. Federal investigators later described the operation as highly coordinated. Fraser was taken from his home, held against his will, and executed. His body was discovered showing clear signs of violence, ruling out accidental death. The Fraser investigation triggered a broader probe into Misk's activities. Detectives noted connections to other unsolved murders, assaults, and criminal acts across Honolulu. Federal agents had been quietly building a case against Misk for years, using wiretaps, surveillance, undercover operations, financial analysis, and flipped witnesses. Every thread uncovered part of a network that had operated openly for almost 2 decades. Misk's organization was structured, disciplined, and brutal. Associates described being ordered to assault rivals, intimidate witnesses, and enforce the organization's rules. Bribes were paid to protect the business, suppress investigations, and maintain control. Retaliation for non-compliance was swift and violent. Misk cultivated influence through donations, charitable work, and public relations, projecting legitimacy while orchestrating a criminal empire behind the scenes. In 2020, federal authorities launched a coordinated sweep. Misk and dozens of associates were arrested. The indictment included 13 counts: racketeering, kidnapping resulting in death, obstruction of justice, and possession of chemical weapons. The chemical weapons charge shocked investigators, indicating access to materials typically associated with warfare or terrorism. The scale of the operation and charges was unprecedented in Hawaii. The trial began in 2024 and lasted 6 months. Over 200 witnesses testified. Wiretaps revealed coded conversations discussing illegal activity. Financial records traced millions of dollars laundered through shell companies and legitimate businesses. Witnesses described assaults, threats, and coercion carried out on Miski's orders. The prosecution depicted a man who saw himself as untouchable, relying on wealth, connections, and fear to maintain absolute control. The defense portrayed him as a successful businessman with enemies attempting to frame him, calling witnesses unreliable and evidence circumstantial. In July 2024, the jury convicted Mike Miski on all 13 counts. Prosecutors sought life imprisonment, arguing that he posed an extreme danger to society. Legal experts predicted he would never walk free. Before sentencing in December 2024, Miski was found unresponsive in his federal detention cell. Medical personnel attempted resuscitation but pronounced him dead. Investigation revealed he had ingested fentanyl. How he obtained it in a federal facility remains unclear. Authorities ruled the cause an overdose. Conspiracy theories quickly circulated. Some suggested he was silenced to protect others in his network. Others claimed he committed suicide to avoid decades in prison. The official investigation could not determine the source of the substance. Because Miski died before sentencing and while appeals were pending, his conviction was vacated. Legally, it was as if the trial had never occurred. Families of victims, including Jonathan Fraser's, were outraged. They had endured months of testimony, reliving trauma, only to see justice erased by a procedural technicality. Despite Miski escaping formal punishment, his empire was dismantled. Dozens of associates were convicted and sentenced to years or decades in prison. The network that Miski spent 2 decades building was effectively destroyed. The case became the largest organized crime prosecution in Hawaii's history. It exposed vulnerabilities in legitimate businesses used to conceal illegal operations and demonstrated the lengths individuals will go to protect power and control. The fallout prompted major reforms. Law enforcement increased oversight of cash-intensive businesses, improved coordination between federal and local authorities, and strengthened witness protection programs. Miski's company was dissolved, assets seized, and reputation destroyed. Jonathan Fraser's family established a foundation in his name to support victims of violent crime and advocate for stronger laws against organized criminal activity. Their work ensures that even without legal closure for Miskie's conviction, his death drove meaningful change. Miskie's empire is gone, his influence erased. His wealth and power could not prevent the collapse of the organization he built. Yet the unresolved questions about his death and the legal technicality that vacated his conviction continue to haunt Hawaii's justice system. The case remains a stark reminder of the danger hidden behind a legitimate facade and the devastation wrought by decades of unchecked criminal enterprise.